So we're here to talk about believing in things you cannot see. Just as a brief note, I do believe in black holes. I heard that question come up earlier. I do believe in things like, I consider myself mildly financially or scientifically literate, so no worries on that front. We will get into things like that a little bit later. So I am here today to talk about science and religion and the world in between. So Agnostic-ish, the book that I wrote, is all about how to find faith in a world that is kind of, a lot of things in the world that you can believe are dictated by science. So we live in an age of science where we know tons of things about the universe. And is it possible to believe in something supernatural or something that is above and beyond that, knowing all that we know about science? So that's kind of the angle that I want to talk about. I think this is a super important topic, especially for this time of year and the place we are in the world right now, just due to all the divisions that come up between different people of different religions, and even between atheists and Christians or agnostics and Christians. There's so much division that I think this is an important topic. This is something I'm personally very passionate about, just because I believe that there is a common ground. Spoiler alert. I think that there will be a way to reconcile Christianity and science, or at least have a conversation between the two. And that's really what I want to talk about today, is if we can have a productive conversation between the intellectual world and the religious world. Can science and religion work together to help understand the world better for both of them? So a little bit about me to start. I'm a huge nerd. That is the first thing to know about me. I was a debater in high school, so this is me. I think this is at Harvard. I traveled the nation as a high school debater, going to tournaments all over the place. So I was very nerdy in high school. When I got to college, I became a little bit more normal, but only statistically. So I was in the top two majors by popularity in Michigan, economics and psychology. And I also was in the top two extracurricular activities by popularity, which were a fraternity and an a cappella group. So statistically, if you were to just roll the dice and throw someone into college, I would appear out of Michigan. But I really enjoyed my experience in Michigan. Economics and psychology are things that are super interesting to me because of how they interrelate. They're both fundamentally about human behavior and why people do the things that they do. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is why do people make the decisions they make? Why do people have the beliefs that they have? And I've been very introspective in myself about why do I have the beliefs that I have. And I really think that these experiences that I've had have shaped who I've become. So this is me now. After I got a haircut from this stage, this is what came out the other side. And I now work, as I said, I work at Deloitte as a management consultant. People often ask, what is consulting? And the best answer that I've ever heard is nobody knows. It's really anything. I will mostly focus with technology companies and telecommunications companies. Right now I'm flying down to Dallas to help AT&T, and I've helped out Sprint in the past and a bunch of other companies. So that's a little bit about me. I share this not because I particularly think that you care who I am, but because I think it does shape who I am and shape the beliefs that I've come to hold. So that's how you make Christian, is a bunch of those experiences all add up to make me. Another important question is how to make a Christian, because I was raised religious. My family has literally always been very religious. So my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, this is true, fled to America in 1636, and he did that because he was a Puritan. He was a Puritan preacher from the Isle of Wight in England. My mother's maiden name is White, so that line continued all the way down. And he fled because he wanted to practice his religion freely. That is who he was. That's who my family, honestly, since then, we've always been a very religious family. So I was raised to be religious, as signified by my first name. That's the obvious piece of evidence that I am a person who was raised to be religious. If you ever had to bet on your kid ending up being religious, that's the bet that you would make. This is a big thing to say, that you're a Christian, you are a Christian. So that's something to know about me, is that my background has led me into a life of faith. But as I continued through middle school, high school, I started to become very skeptical. So this is very fitting for this group of people, the Chicago Skeptics. I did become a very skeptical person throughout the experiences in my life. So I grew up in Lakeville. It's a very small town in Minnesota. A lot of people believe. So it's really a town where almost all of my high school graduating class believed in the Christian faith. Basically everybody that I knew, all of my role models, all of my coaches, everybody that I grew up learning from taught me to believe in God and taught me to believe religiously. But kind of around the same time that I started to be a deviant, to be typically a teenager that was angsty and just wanted to fight back against his parents. A lot of things went with that. I quit my piano lessons, I stopped going to church. All of those things kind of happened at once, and that was what really spurred me to be skeptical. I kind of shunned the faith that I had grown up with. It was very, very abrupt, honestly. It was an all or nothing kind of proposition, and so I fell out of faith when I was in middle school going on into high school. And that's where I left for a long time before I went to Ann Arbor. So this is another thing that really helped me become skeptical. I was experiencing so many different perspectives that simply weren't present in Lakeville, Minnesota. So many people, literally there are more people that fit inside the stadium. There's like 3 times as many people that fit inside Michigan Stadium as are in the entire town of Lakeville. So I think that this is something that really helped me experience a lot of different perspectives, to know that there are things that you can believe that are outside of just religion or just not. And that's really the story that I tell in Agnostic-ish, is how I fell out of faith and then what happened as a result of that. What did I try to understand about myself, what I actually believe? Because the worst thing is that I was skeptical about my skepticism after a certain point. I got to the point where I didn't know why I had taken such an extreme stance against the faith of my parents and of my great-great-great-grandfather. There wasn't a good reason. I honestly didn't have any evidence that said I should believe that way. I didn't have anything that was really provable or that I could point and say, hey, this is the reason. This is why I don't believe in Christianity anymore. So the point of all this is to say that I was very skeptical about my skepticism. I got to the point where I just wanted to understand, what do I truly believe and why? And that's where Agnostic-ish came from. It's a book about science, religion, and the world between. My mom loves it. Honestly, it was just something that I worked on for a number of years. As soon as I graduated from Michigan. Surprising. Yeah, that's the back of the blurb. That's the best blurb I got. But this was a passion project of mine. I wrote it on the side of working at a full-time job, so probably the most frequent hours that I spent writing it were midnight to 2 a.m., and the most frequent place that I wrote it was in hotel rooms across the country. So this was just a passion project of mine, something where I really wanted to explore my faith, and really this whole train of thought that we're about to embark on is a result of that really deep introspection and really deep research that I did. So one other thing to note about my whole background is that I'm not a traditionally scientific person. I don't have a background in biology, I don't have a background in chemistry, I haven't formally studied religion, I haven't formally studied any of this. But I think that that's important. I think that's something that I actually like about my perspective, and something that my perspective uniquely has to share, because most of the people in the world are not scientists, and most of the people in the world are not theologians. Most people don't dedicate the majority of their time to understanding these topics. So even if you are a person who is very scientifically oriented, if you know a lot about science, you're very literate in science, I think that's, first of all, a great thing. I would hope to be that literate in science and religion. But I think that it's important to note that if you are one of those people, most people are not as well-versed as you are. So one of the things that I want to get across throughout this presentation is that this is something that I hope is applicable to everybody. It's something that everybody can understand, because I am effectively everybody in this scenario. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a theologian, I'm just a guy who is an interested amateur, we'll call it. So that's the background, and here is what we're going to talk about today. So my bold hypothesis is that science and religion are actually more similar. They're sort of alike. They're more similar than you might think they are. So we're going to talk about this in 3 different ways, 3 different pieces of the puzzle that kind of build on each other throughout. So we're going to start by talking about sharing a magisterium. If you don't know what that is, we will get there. It's a very unapproachable word, but you'll have to forgive it. Second, we'll talk about falling in love with models, which is probably even more unapproachable, and you don't understand where that's going, but we'll get there. And then finally, we'll bring it all together with believing in things we cannot see. So, sharing a magisterium, what does that mean? So, this is actually an idea that came from Stephen Jay Gould. He was a paleontologist and a biologist. He actually just passed away about 14 years ago now, but he had an amazing idea while he was alive, and he really did a good job to bring it to a very wide audience. And that's the idea that science and religion are separate and totally separate, non-overlapping magisteria. So in layman's terms, a magisteria is a domain. If you think about a Venn diagram, it's a bubble. It's just everything that your particular science, your particular discipline covers. So the Magisterium of Science would include things like the facts about the universe. It would include things like the Big Bang. It would include things like evolution. It would include things like human consciousness. All things that can be described by science are included in its Magisterium. The Magisterium of Mathematics might be numbers and equations. The Magisterium of Linguistics might be words and sentences. Just everything that is included in your universe is your Magisterium. So Stephen Jay Gould's idea that he was actually featured in Simpsons. This is real. He was in the Simpsons episode for having this idea. His idea was that the Venn diagram bubbles of religion and science never form the little sliver in the middle where it overlaps. They never overlap. That was his idea. So if it was true, these are his words now. So the key thing to take away from here, this might be small text, but science covers the empirical universe, and religion covers moral meaning and value. That's the way that he divided up the entire world, to say that science gets to talk about facts, it gets to talk about things that are happening in the universe, and religion is just, they only get to talk about moral value. So they get to tell me what I should do, science gets to tell me what is. The way that Stephen Jay Gould put it down here at the bottom is that science gets the age of rocks, and religion gets the rock of ages. I really love that phrase. So the point of this idea is that they do not overlap. And this is a way, if this idea is true, then it's a way that we can separate and totally reconcile science and religion. They could both be entirely true at the same time, if it's the case that they don't overlap. But I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that people from both sides of the debate would say that is probably not the case. Scientists especially, scientists would not want to say that they have no domain over morality. The picture of the cute otters holding hands is evidence of that. Animals love each other. There's evidence of animals being altruistic. There are questions about whether packs form because animals can reciprocate if they understand tit for tat. And if that's a moral concept, then science has some domain over morality. There's also the scientific study of art, which is another common piece of evidence that people use as something science can't touch, but it absolutely can. There's a lot of evidence that aesthetically pleasing things are symmetrical. That's something that is a testable hypothesis about beauty. There's so many different ways that science can attack, and well, attack is a very strong word, but science can address things like morality, things like art, things that you would typically consider to be in that moral meaning and value magisterium. So I don't think that scientists would agree. But also, I don't think that religious folks would particularly agree if they really thought through the implications of what it would mean to separate the magisteria. So this is the Shroud of Turin, if you've ever heard of it. It was a shroud that presumably, the story is, covered the face of Jesus as he was laid and interred. And so this impression that you see is very faint, but the impression is of Jesus' face is the idea. So I'm not bringing this up, I'm not putting this in the presentation to say, hey, here's Jesus, look at him. I'm saying this is a piece of physical evidence that religious folks have tried to use. And this is an example of magisteria overlapping, to say that there is a fact in the world that would make my view of the world true as a religious person. So there are plenty of other examples like that. If you take Genesis 1, it makes a statement that is a truth statement about the universe. It says, God created the universe. That is a statement that could be true or could be false. And presumably, if it is true or false, there would be certain things that would follow. So that's what this list is over here. Stephen Meyer, who's a guy who wrote a lot of really great books about science and religion, this is from the back of one of his books. And this is just a list. There's actually more, but I took the ones that probably make the most sense, of testable hypotheses that would be true if the world was intelligently designed. So typically, you would think of that as something that is completely outside the realm of science. You think science, intelligent design, totally separate. There's no way that those could ever be brought together. But Meyer would disagree. He would say that here are some ways that you could test whether intelligent design is true. And honestly, I'm not too sure how much I like a lot of them. The one that gets closest to me is when he talks about how an intelligent and perfect, presumably, designer would design animals. But the problem with that is that a lot of animals are very poorly designed if you look into them. My favorite example is giraffes. So there's a nerve that goes from the brain to the larynx of a giraffe. And here's where it is for us. It just goes straight here, like right behind your ear. But for a giraffe, it hooks under this part of their body, like under their, what is our breastbone. So if you think about a giraffe, it goes all the way down and all the way back up. It's the least efficient way that nerve could have got there, and presumably that would be a piece of evidence against a person sitting down and drawing a giraffe for the first time. You wouldn't organize the city like that if that was like a sewage line or a water line or something like that. So what I mean to say here is not about the truth or the falsity of any of these statements, or whether or not these are actually things that could be true for and you would rule in favor of intelligent design. But I do mean to say that science and religion would both contest the fact that they can't address the magisterium of the other. That's the entire point that I'm trying to make in this first part of the presentation. So I do believe that there is a world in between that science and religion have to talk about either together or against each other or at the same time. It's not as simple as saying, here's the domain of science, they get all the facts. Here's the domain of religion, they get all the morals and the art and the whatever. It's not that simple to separate them and have them both be equally true. I think that there's a world in between, and I think that they share the same magisterium. So that's the first kind of point that I want to get across, is that they do conflict, they do have the potential for conflict, but the question is, can they both survive or live or thrive or work together in this world? And that's what I want to talk about in the next two pieces of this presentation. Before I move on to falling in love with models, does anybody have questions about magisteria, about or any piece of evidence that they would like, or like ideas they have? Yeah.
So the Venn diagram, are you going to go into that next? Like the Venn diagram of the two, there's a small sliver, there's a big sliver, are they on top of each other?
Yeah, I'll talk about both of these next two sections. We'll talk about ways that they are on top of each other. Okay. Yeah, we'll talk about pieces. And the interesting thing is that they both come at the same issues from similar but related, slightly different ways. So that's the interesting thing, is to see how religion looks at something, and then from the different perspective, how does science look at the same thing? I think that there are lots of examples of times that's happened. Okay, so falling in love with models. First things first, models are a very scientific way of thinking about the world, and that's kind of the baseline that I want to start off with. So the domain of science, the magisterium of science, is very, very concerned with simplifying the world to make it understandable to a finite human brain. So there are infinitely many stars in the universe. There's so many, they're not actually infinite, but there are a lot of stars in the universe. How do we make sense of that big a number? Well, we make models of the universe. We draw orbits that are like probably more simple than they actually are in the world. And we, for example, the atom is a great example of a model. So the way that you typically think about the nucleus of the atom and the electrons whizzing around the outside is as a physical object, where there would be a little tiny atom, a little electron flying around these electron rings. But that's not actually how it exists in the world. That's just a model of how it exists in the world. So there aren't little particles that are flying around an atom. There's just a cloud of probability that is around that atom. If you looked at the periodic table, the different rows, the different periods of the table explain those electron shells. So as you have enough electrons, a shell fills up, and the electrons have to move out further away from the nucleus. So there's a way to understand that as the model of the atom, which is there are neutrons, there are electrons, there are so many different parts, and like even within the nucleus of the cell, we have the smaller quarks that make up the protons and the neutrons, everything like that. All of that is a simplification of a more complex reality. So one of my favorite quotes that I have written down about this back here. Did I do that? No peeking. No peeking. One of my favorite quotes that I've written down about that is that it's from Paul Valery. He says that everything simple is false, and everything which is complex is unusable. So I think that's interesting, and I think that's telling, and that shows you the value of a model. So what a good model does is it takes a complex reality, and really losing nothing important or material makes it simpler for us to understand. So that is the entire realm of science. We have the periodic table that organizes our elements in an order that makes sense to us and allows us to do useful things. We have the idea of the atom. And that is a way that we can understand the very smallest of things and make sense of it, even though it's a thing that we can't see with our eyes. It's not something we can observe a little electron whizzing around, but it makes sense to us, and it helps us predict things, in fact, to think of it as that, to think of the electron shells and things like that. So That is the default unit that scientists use to understand the world. They make models. An interesting thing about models, though, is that they are not the reality that they seek to describe. So this is true if a model is useful at all. And I'll just read this whole quote because I love it. Neil Gaiman's one of my favorite authors. If you've ever read American Gods, has anybody ever read that book? I love that book. This is a quote from Neil Gaiman. He says, "One describes the tale best by telling the tale. You see, the way one describes a story to oneself or the world is by telling the story. It is a balancing act and it is a dream. The more accurate the map, the more it resembles the territory. The most accurate map possible would be the territory, and thus would be a perfectly accurate but perfectly useless map. The tale is the map that is the territory." So the point is that when you make a model, you're making those simplifications to help yourself understand them and to help realize something about the model that gives you deeper insight into what's actually happening. You're taking something that's too complex and you're distilling down the important parts of it that help you understand more. But the problem is that if we fall in love with models, George Box famously said that statisticians, like artists, have the bad habit of falling in love with their models. If we fall in love with our models, then we forget this truth about them, which is that they are not the reality. They are not the territory that they're seeking to describe. Maps are incredibly useful. They tell us more than we can see by just looking out at the terrain. I don't know the elevation right here, but my map does. We have to realize that the map is not the physical place. It doesn't have all of the detail that we could possibly have about a location. And that's something to remember when we use models. And that's something that scientists should remember when they're using models as well. So, the way that this has anything to do with religion is that I sincerely believe that there are things in religious faith that are model-like, that are like models, that are used in the same way as scientists use models. So if we're looking at our Venn diagram, this would be one of the ways that we look at things in the middle, is a scientist would try to take the facts of the situation and boil it down into a model. And I think that religious folks do the same thing as well. And I think they have done it in the past. And a lot of times, scientifically minded people get in trouble because they look at the map as if it was the territory. So they see a religious person using a map, using a model, and they assume, and this is also true of a lot of religious folks who don't understand that there's a territory behind it as well, and that's definitely true. But I think that there are a lot of examples, particularly in the Bible, which is what we're about to talk about, of models that have been forgotten as models. So there are lots of stories in the Bible that are absolutely insane. My favorite one is Noah's Ark. There's no way, right? There is no way that the entire earth flooded. I just simply can't believe it's true. There's not enough water. And I think that there are so many things that would have to happen for it to be true that just simply are physically impossible. If there were 2 of every animal on the boat, what about asexual animals? What about snails that only live in North America? Do they have to ride waves across the Atlantic to get to the Middle East on time? Like, it just didn't happen. But I do believe that that is something that is a confusion of a map for a territory, or a territory for a map. We think that we are describing the entire truth of the situation by looking at the story of Noah's Ark as just, there's no way it's literally true. It couldn't have literally happened. But an important thing, and this is one of my favorite books that I ever read, I actually brought it today, is Owen Barfield's Saving the Appearances. In this book, he argues that the biblical stories are models, that they're ways of understanding the world, but that map to territory distinction was lost over time. So you might recognize these pictures. This is Aslan from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. That's Gandalf from Lord of the Rings. The 2 authors of those books, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, were buddies. They were friends. They were part of a society at Oxford together. And actually, Owen Barfield was another member of that society. So you probably know these 2 guys. You might not know Barfield. But he was friends with these amazing authors. Actually, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, one of the most famous books, a super, super unbelievably famous book, was dedicated to Owen Barfield's daughter. So Barfield was in with the right people. He inspired a lot of the right people. And he actually, J.R.R. Tolkien credited him for bringing metaphor as something, or instilling in him the idea that metaphor was something worth pursuing and had a place in society. So maps have a place in society. Without Barfield, we might not have Gandalf, is what I'm trying to say. But the idea that Barfield had, and this is an extremely interesting idea, it's a little bit involved, but I hope you'll bear with me for a second, is about how we interpret literal versus how we interpret metaphorical things. And this all ties back to the stories of the Bible with the question, are they literally true? So in the beginning, there was sense data. We have the ways that we see the world through our senses. We see things through our eyes. We pick up photons through our eyes. We smell things, etc. When we interpret those through our consciousness, when we bring our brains into the fold and we start processing those things, that's figuration. That's how people interact with the world. That's how we process things. But the important thing, and here's where the first map territory distinction comes in, is that our figuration of sense data is itself a map. It is not the actual thing. We are not seeing, we are not actually feeling the table. There's nothing about the table that's interacting with me right now. It is all through my consciousness. It is all through a map, which is my particular way of understanding the world. So this is, we'll wait on that for a second. We'll get to Moses. So we have our sense data. We perceive it as people. One thing that we are very, very accustomed to in our world is thinking about that. Thinking about how our brains intermediate between ourselves, meaning our consciousness experience, and the real world. So that is alpha thinking in his book. The book is super interesting. I would very much recommend it to get more into these concepts, but I'll just tell you enough so we can kind of get to the point. Beta thinking is the next level. It's the second order of thinking. So if you think about it as the base truth is the sense data. Our interpretation of that data is figuration. Thinking about that, one step recursion is alpha thinking. Second step recursion, thinking about alpha thinking, is beta thinking. So it just gets gradually more further away from the base truth of sense data. It gets gradually more like a map as you go along the right to left line. So that's a lot, but the important thing is to realize the different places that we are right now, the way that we think about the world, and the way that people thought about the world when they were writing the Bible. So the first quote is relevant to Moses. This is something that he would have thought. So one of the hypotheses that Barfield has is that this thinking over here, the alpha and beta thinking, the second, third order thinking, where you're thinking about thinking and you're reflecting on how you are interacting with the world, that's all new. That's not something that happened back in the days of especially the Old Testament. And so this is a quote from his book, the book Saving the Appearances. He says, here we go. Moses is back, don't worry. Whatever their religious or political beliefs, men of the same community in the same period share a certain background picture of the world and their relation to it. The background picture then was of man as a microcosm within the macrocosm. It is clear that man, back in the days of the Bible, did not feel himself isolated by his skin from the world outside him to the same extent that we do. He was integrated or morticized into it, each different part of him being united to a different part of it by some invisible thread. In his relation to his environment, the man of the Middle Ages was rather less like an island and rather more like an embryo than we are. So the point is that back in the days of the Old Testament, Barfield believes that people were more in tune with their environment and less kind of reflective upon it. They were less self-conscious of the ways that they understood the world, which means it was a less disintermediated way. That's a double negative, but they were more directly involved in the creation of their sense experience and the creation of their figuration in the world. He believes that, he calls it original participation, where he was directly participating in the creation of the world through his senses. So it's not the case that they were, let me tell the other story and then I'll get to literal versus metaphorical. So here's me, Moses and me. Look at the poses. Kind of works out. So that was then. Then was direct participation, original participation. Now we have forgotten that the map and the territory are there, that there is a difference between this kind of sense data and this kind of higher, very, very much higher order thinking. And this is another quote from Barfield. He says, "Of course, as time went on, the metaphors of language faded. We no longer call up any mental image of standing beneath when we use the word understand, or of physical pressing out when we think of expressing a sentiment or an idea. The progress was assumed to be from the metaphor through the trope to the ordinary straightforward meaning, But whatever meanings its words might bear today, language was considered historically as an issue of faded or dead metaphors. So we have lost the metaphor. We have lost the language and the understanding of the world as we have lost. The way that they understood the world was very direct. It was something that. So here's an example. If you've ever read the great anthologies like the Platos of the world, or the Odysseys of the world, you'll see the phrase "rosy-fingered dawn" very often. That's a phrase that comes up all the time. And so the point that Barfield was trying to make, and I understand that it's very involved, was that experience of describing the dawn as rosy fingers, to us that's a metaphor. That's a metaphor. It's not rosy fingers. No, there's no God twinkling his fingers above the dawn. But the way that ancient people understood the world, that was, in our words, literal. They literally saw that there were fingers above the dawn. That's the way that they understood what was happening. They didn't understand it. They don't have the same access to science that we did. They don't understand that the world was rotating. They didn't understand that there weren't celestial orbs above them that were holding all the stars in place. So the point is, when they saw a rosy-fingered dawn, they saw that as what we now think of as literal. It was literally true to them. So when you write down a story in the Bible, you think, as the person writing down the story of Moses, that it is literally true, that there was literally, quote-unquote, a flood that covered the entire world. To us, that might be a metaphor. That's how we might think of it, is that it's a metaphorical sweeping away of the world. It's a metaphor of cleansing the world of sin. It's a metaphor that is not the literal truth. But the point of Barfield's book, and I would seriously highly recommend it because it is so involved and so interesting, is that the distinction between those different things literally didn't exist, literally. They didn't exist between literal and metaphorical during the time of the writing of the Bible. So, the point of all this, could it be possible that the stories of the Bible, especially those about the physical world, are just models? That's kind of the point that I want to make. So, the way that ancients understood the world was different from how we understand the world. Point one. Point two, if that's true, then the stories that they represented in the Bible, the way that they chose to talk about science and about the physical world, would be different. They had a different conscious experience of the world. So really my point in all of this is just to say that if it was true that God was trying to say something true about the world, something literally true about the world to people in ancient times, he couldn't have done it the same way as he would tell it to us. We understand so much more now. Like, I'm imagining a world in which the Bible has things written in like, hey, make sure you build a Large Hadron Collider. Like, make sure that you look inside atoms. Make sure you get all the way down. P.S. Pluto isn't a planet. Like, that's not how the Bible would be written, because that's not how people understood the world in the times of the ancients. So this is all to say that the way that scientists understand the world through models is also how religious folks can understand the world through models. And it really is just a question of remembering, in both cases, that the map is not the territory. And finally, the grand finale. Now we're done with that Barfield stuff. Christian's putting his book away because that was a lot of reading. Let's talk about things we cannot see. So,
Can I ask?
Yeah, absolutely.
What's the distinction between, there are four different
Yeah, I'll go back to that.
levels in the line. I don't understand the distinction between thinking and thinking about thinking.
So, this one is just bare bones understanding. Figuration is thinking about understanding.
It's like an initial map.
An initial map, exactly. It's how you perceive sense data. Because the sense data is not like what you are experiencing as the smell, it's like the physical underlying reality of the smell. Alpha thinking is thinking about figuration. So it's thinking about the ways that we understand the world. So thinking about the ways that my nose has changed the smell based on what I've smelled in the past. Thinking about the ways that when I'm listening to a song, I can understand this is that song. This is the song that I've heard in the past, and I can start filling in the gaps of what I'm understanding. That's an example of alpha thinking. Beta thinking is a reflection on the nature of alpha thinking. So it is thinking about how we think about understanding the world. It's the second layer. It's the second order. Yeah, so this is what the book is. The book is an example of beta thinking. So if I was going to write a book that was alpha thinking entirely, it would be a book about the way that I talk about the world, the way that my conscious understanding affects the world. That would be the premise of that book. The premise of this book, the beta thinking premise of this book, is the way that people have understood their conscious experience has changed over time. So it's like the if you isolate alpha thinking, like I think that we understand alpha thinking. Alpha thinking is thinking about consciousness. If you put thinking about consciousness in a box and look at it, put it over there, there would be boxes for different areas throughout time. There would be the 1800s box and the 1900s box and the ancients box and ours now. Looking at that, stepping back from the box of thinking about figuration and looking back at all of the different boxes throughout time, that's beta thinking.
Christian,
Yeah.
alpha thinking, using your map metaphor, is alpha thinking kind of filling in the details of the map after you've gone through the figuration based on past experience and knowledge? Is that it?
Yeah, I mean that's a big part of it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's how you understand that process of filling the gaps. Yeah.
How did these mid-19th century Oxfordian top of the world
Yeah.
ivory tower folks figure out that those poor ancients couldn't possibly have the cognitive ability to think about thinking when we know that people have been thinking about thinking and creating stories and metaphors for eons?
Yeah.
I mean, it just seems, I'm sorry, it seems crazy.
Yeah, it does.
Actually,
I agree.
I take that judgmental word back. It seems illogical.
Yeah, it does seem difficult. I identify with that. I think it seems difficult to be able to look back and say how someone was perceiving the world. It seems like borderline impossible to be able to step inside someone's brain.
Did the fool the good? He was thinking about thinking. He was thinking.
Yeah, I think.
People were thinking about thinking.
Yeah, I think the point he's trying to make is that these distinctions and the ways that we can kind of step back from the process, because the way that you can think about this is each one of these is a stepping back and a reflection. I think that the way that the like kind of ancient philosophers and like the ancient people like writing the Bible and stuff, Barfield's argument about all those people would be that the way that they perceived a lot of things was not, they didn't think about their consciousness a lot. There's not a lot of writing about consciousness from like way back in ancient times. So I think that the particular argument that Barfield's trying to make is that if it was true that they did think the same way that we did, there probably would have been more of that. There probably would have been more times that you have this second order stepping back and this third order stepping back from that philosophy. Because you're right, there definitely were times, there were tons of times that people talked about metaphor, and people talked about stories, and people analyzed like ancient metaphors. Like there's some semblance of that idea back in ancient times.
I mean, you say Noah's Ark is patent and ridiculous, whatever.
Yeah.
But whoever wrote that story either was writing metaphor, or if you believe it's handed down knowledge from deity, that's
Yeah.
unprovable.
Yeah,
So,
true.
so either someone thought this literally happened,
Yeah.
or someone was telling a story as an example.
So I think Barfield's argument is that there wasn't that distinction for them. That they weren't, that the way that they...
wrote it down. The person
Or they didn't write it down. Yeah. The person that wrote it down, did they think it actually happened?
Right.
Yes.
Or made up the story.
The person who and like wrote the story down thought that it happened, and the way that we would understand how they wrote it down would be as a metaphor. The way that person would have understood how they wrote it down was just as they wrote everything else down, which was no distinction between literal and metaphoric.
So the person who originally came up with the story, there was either a person who experienced this in this sense data sort of way.
So I think that
someone who made up a story.
my best, like, obviously I have no idea obviously like how that person thought, but I do.
I would tend to think it's just, somebody experienced a flash flood at some point, and then the story became from that to the world was flooded because their world was flooded, and then the whole ark thing kind of fell into place with it. The imagination goes crazy, thinking things. So I mean, it's.
Yeah, I agree with that. I definitely agree with that. I think that the most likely scenario was a real event that a moral was drawn into, but people forget that there wasn't a difference then. Like, he was literally telling the truth. He was telling the truth about what he experienced. He experienced the world flooding because God didn't like the sin that was happening. He directly experienced, wow, I can't believe God is flooding the whole world right now, even though he didn't even know about North America. And there's no way he could have known if that was flooding or not, So his whole world was flooding. His whole world was flooding, and he perceived because God was mad at him, or mad at the world, or whatever. And so that is probably what happened, is that he wrote down his truth, his literal quote-unquote truth, but we would interpret that now as metaphoric. That there were a lot of things that were written
You know,
in.
he may have written it down as a flood story, and then over the years, people,
That's also
the
possible.
zealots might have jumped in and said, of course God was punishing you, and it's, you know, so I mean, it takes years and years and generations for these stories to evolve.
Yeah, that's one of my biggest things about how the Bible is written is that it has been around for so long, and there have been so many very deliberate events that have changed the Bible. Like the Council of Trent, like people literally said, here are the books that are true and here are the books that are false, and that happened in like 1,000 years ago. It's like, how do you know? Yeah.
So, sharing a brain with Jen just slightly, I had a similar question because, again, the perception of the Oxford guys, what I'm actually reminded of is within the last 50 years, there's been this project called the Jesus Project, which there's archaeologists, historians, theologians, all kinds of different people that have come together to determine what parts of the New Testament could Jesus have actually said what he's quoted as saying. And so it's like this whole scholar looking at it from a whole bunch of different scholars.
Is it like a linguistic thing? Like he didn't have these words to say?
In some ways, yeah, but part of it is also like the perception. And so one of the conclusions of this is that a lot of the stories like Revelation was about a leader at that time. That it was a metaphor. That really it was something that was kind of like a teaching moment for the people of the time, but it wasn't literal. So it's just it's interesting to kind of see the difference. And obviously things can change in 150 years, but it's just something for me to kind of think about because I have had a lot of Bible study and religious study in my past, and the idea that the people who were living in the desert and having nomadic lives and all that kind of stuff, that they wouldn't have the same ways of thinking that I as a human being have today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The noble childlike savage.
Yeah, it just rings false to me. So it's interesting, and I would be interested to read this book and just kind of like see if I understand it differently. Not that you're doing a bad job of understanding.
Well, it's a lot to explain aside from Moses and me standing like this.
It's just interesting to think about because I feel like it would be extremely arrogant of me to say, well, the ancients they couldn't understand quantum physics. It's like, yeah, they could have, but
They potentially could have, but that doesn't mean they understood that.
yeah. Well, and how many of us today
They
really
didn't
understand?
understand.
Yes, that's also a good question.
I know a little about it because of a model.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go. Exactly.
Extrapolation which we experience. If this flood is taking up my entire world, I have to assume that it's happening everywhere.
Right.
If people around me are dying of the plague, I'm assuming that everyone everywhere around this is happening everywhere that I know.
Yeah.
So it's everywhere.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of one of the morals that I want to kind of take out of this is that in the same way that models simplify quantum physics for us, the story of the flood simplified that catastrophe for them, and that's how they understood it literally happening. So I think that's probably the takeaway that I have out of this one is that there's nothing inherently not literal, or there's nothing inherently like trying to deceive in the Bible, maybe, but in my reading of it, that's not how. There's a way to interpret it that doesn't have to be the case. Any more questions about this before we go on to our last final chapter? Great. So, what we've all been waiting for. Leaving things we cannot see. So, step one, I have a bunch of facts written down on this guy, so might as well pull it out for now. So, the coolest things in the universe are hidden. And by hidden, I mean things that we cannot see, things that we cannot observe, things that we cannot directly test or repeat. Probably the most important one is repeat. So, all of the things that I really love about science are things that are non-repeatable events, things that you could not confirm by testing again. So the universe was created in the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. That's something that we could never do again if we wanted to keep our universe intact, probably. There are also fundamental limits that you run up against thermodynamically if you go back and try to get back at the beginning from what we have right now, just like in the cosmic background radiation of the world. So if you point a thermometer out into space and measure it anywhere in any direction, it's 3 degrees Kelvin. Like the background cosmic radiation, the little buzzing of the universe is 3 degrees Kelvin. That's true everywhere in every direction. And that's actually one of the reasons why we know that there was a Big Bang. Because if it were true that because it's consistent everywhere, it must have been all in one place at one time. or else there's no way that it could have smoothed out to that effect, because that way in the universe, 13.8 billion light years away, and that way in the universe, 13.8 more billion light years away, would have never interacted unless it was much smaller in the past. So that's one of the pieces of evidence that physicists have for the beginning of the universe. Interestingly, though, if you cram the universe smaller and smaller, if you play the clock of the universe backwards from now 13.8 billion years to 13.7, then 13 and 10 and 5, and go all the way back to the very beginning of the universe, we hit a fundamental limit before t equals 0, before the very, very beginning. It happens at 100th of a second after the start of the beginning of the universe, which seems petty to say 13.8 billion years, but we don't understand is 100th of a second. But we can't physically, with our knowledge of physics, understand before the first 100th of a second, because literally the laws of physics, literally again, the word coming back, the laws of physics boil away at that point. Things don't behave consistently. They start behaving totally chaotically. So there is a fundamental limit to what we can understand and see about the beginning of the universe, because first, it's unrepeatable. We can't do it again. And because our ways of understanding the beginning of the universe, as we have in the past, boil away once you get to 100th of a second after t equals 0. String theory is another thing that is a very promising thing that we're trying to figure out what came before the bang, what created the bang, what happened in the very beginning of the universe. But again, fundamentally, there is something fundamentally unseeable about strings. String theory is a theory of the universe where there are 11-dimensional strings, who knows what that means, that are within and curled up inside of our 4-dimensional universe with all of our 3 normal ones in time. So to get from string theory to our actual existence, there has to be this curling up process that happens. But the interesting thing is that strings themselves, so the brute physical reality behind that idea of the universe, a string is the smallest width possible. So Planck, there are a lot of Planck numbers in the world, P-L-A-N-C-K. And that fundamentally, just across the board, are the smallest increments of a thing that are possible. So string theory posits that there are all of these 11-dimensional, you know, so that means strings, that are a Planck length wide. And fundamentally, that is something that we cannot see. It's exactly 1 quadrillion times smaller than the smallest thing that we've ever physically and observed, or been able to testably or repeatedly observe within the universe via our most strong microscopes. Our microscopes go down to 10 to the negative 21 meters. It's huge. It's an unbelievably small number. It's such awesome power, but that's still 1 quadrillion, or 1 times 10 to the 15th away. That's that many degrees of magnitude away from being able to observe a string. So it seems like something that is also fundamentally unachievable. Another thing that is a part of the universe is dark matter. So you've probably heard of dark matter, or at least had the concept of dark matter or dark energy appear upon you at some point. Scientists believe that way more than, so about the real physical matter of the universe is about, I think it's 4%. I wrote it down. Yeah, it's 4% of the universe is physical matter. 74% of the universe is dark energy. And dark matter, which by definition is things that we do not understand what they are. We don't get it. All that we know is that the spiral galaxies of the universe aren't flying apart, so there must be enough matter in there to hold everything together. We know that dark matter is there. We have no idea what it is, and we have no way of observing it right now. And then finally, evolution. This is a fundamentally unrepeatable thing that we can force to repeat. So yes, we can cause mosquitoes to mate with each other and mutate in minor ways throughout the course of a scientific experiment. We have done that. We've done it with fruit flies 1,000,000 times over. But we can't replicate the wide range of how species evolve over time and over millions and millions of generations throughout millions and millions of years. The amount of time since we diverged from primates. So when we went from 24 to 23 chromosomes, when we became Homo as the genus, is it a genus? Who knows? When we diverged from primates, that is the same amount of time from the beginning of the universe as I am to 1,333,000 years old. So fundamentally, we cannot understand how long that is. I'm as close to 1 million as we are to understanding the entire length of time that life has been around in the universe. So it just seems like something that we can't possibly have a big enough sample size on yet. It seems like something that our normal tools of scientific inquiry cannot give us access to. So the point I'm trying to make through all of these examples is that science is not always as hard as we tend to think it is. So you can imagine a spectrum of hard to soft, where hard is math, 1 + 1 = 2, and soft is like, call it sociology or something like that, something on the very opposite side that creates lots of great predictions about the world, that there are a lot of great ways to study those things, but there's no conceivable way that you could say that sociology is true in the same way that 1 + 1 = 2 is true. So you can imagine that as a spectrum, and we tend to think that a lot of our science is pushed up towards this end of the spectrum, that we have a lot of like physics, great, very much pushed up against that edge. It's basically applied math, good to go, it's true. Chemistry, just applied physics. Biology, just applied chemistry. So we get slowly further away, slowly towards where our predictions are less deductively true, to the point of 1 + 1 = 2 is deductively true. But I think that we would be surprised to learn that a lot of the things that we believe about science, and a lot of the things that are the most important about science, are pretty far down the spectrum, are not as far towards math as we might think that they are. So, one of the examples we'll get into over here, but I think that the important thing to take away from this is that there are things in science that we believe and that we need to believe and that are very important. The coolest things in the universe, from the beginning of the universe to human evolution, to all those things, are things that our normal tools of science cannot allow us to address. And committing a cardinal sin and hopping back a slide really fast, the reason why there's a picture of a bird is because of Darwin and his finches. The type of science that, and this is a finch, who knew? That's what a finch looks like. Darwin's finches, the way that he discovered on the origin of species, the way that he discovered the things that became part of that book, were from a form of science that was not repeatable. He explicitly acknowledged this is a historical understanding of science. I'm taking the facts that are available. So in our magisterium of the world that covers the physical facts and the moral facts and all of those things, our overlapping magisteria, all of those facts come together and they say that this is the best explanation of what had happened. This is the best explanation of the facts. But fundamentally, and this is like where we get into the hard versus soft spectrum, the hardest piece of science would be the observation that the beak sizes in finches in the Galapagos Islands have changed over time. That is a fact. That is an absolute fact. It's observable. It's something that we've seen. But the thing that made Darwin's insight so brilliant was that he found the thing, he really found an explanation of that made perfect sense with that explanation and that fact and another fact and all these other facts in the world. So, but that process of finding the right explanation was not hard science. It wasn't something that he observed. He didn't observe the theory of evolution, he observed the change of the beak size. So going back again to our map versus territory, the map, the thing that is true, the sense data, the figuration, whatever you want to say, that was that the beaks were changing. That was the fact. That is the hard scientific fact. But the interpretation of that theory, the thing that was behind it, the way that he came to understand it, was not true. Or it was not necessarily true in the same way that that other thing was. So, I mean, even looking historically, if you look, say that you were in a science class 1,000 years ago today, every single thing that you would learn is wrong. Everything. Every single thing that you would learn in that class is just patently false by what we know about the world. But it's still, in the words of Barfield, it saved the appearances. It made it so that we understood these physical things with a coherent theory of the world. But the important thing to realize, and this is where it comes together between religion and science, I think, is that science thinks that it's just observing the beak size of finches and discovering evolution, when really the theory of evolution is a totally separate process from the scientific discovery that went into it. So, this is one of my favorite quotes, and one of the quotes that I think really brings together the kind of thinking that I've been talking about, kind of the middle ground that I'm trying to believe exists. C.S. Lewis, one of our friends with J.R. Tolkien and Owen Barfield, said, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." So Christianity as a intellectual, scientific way of understanding the world is possible. It's just, do the religious hypotheses make sense with our physical interpretation of the world? Is it possible that the way that we reconcile all of these physical observations about the world is it even conceivably true that a religious explanation, a hypothesis put forward by a religious person, is the best explanation of the facts that we know? I think that, of course, that's possible. Obviously, the question is whether it is, but of course it is possible. And that's really the entire message that I wanted to get across today. We tend to think that science is this exercise of we find a dot, we find our beak size of our finches, and then we just go and we collect more dots. And we find our way that we can make sense of this. We look at this and we say, look, there's a line. This is the truth. The line is the truth. We have this thing, it is uniformly positive. There's slight variation, but that's the world, whatever. There's a line there. We see the line. Everybody can see the line. The problem is, though, that we forget the line and the dots are not the same thing. We forget that the territory and the map are not the same thing, that figuration and sense state are not the same thing. We are fundamentally one step away, even in our scientific endeavors, from being able to observe the trend line that runs through that. The trend line doesn't exist. It's just our best explanation at the time. So I fundamentally believe that that is the way that faith exists in Christianity. It is people looking at all the experiences that have happened in their lives. And granted, a lot of those experiences will be shaped by the way that they were raised. So when I was raised, I was brought to an event when I was 5 years old where there were a group of bodybuilders at our church. And they said, if you believe in God, you can also tear this phone book in half and smash ice with your head. That was a lesson that I got when I was growing up. And I was like, sweet, I'm in, let's do it. That is something that shaped my experience of Christianity. But it doesn't mean that any of my experiences are any less true or less real, or I'm being any disingenuine by believing in religion at all. It's just that my experiences in my life have shaped up to say, okay, when I look at something like this, I can say, okay, there's a gap in the middle, but I know it fills it. There are some things that I don't understand about the world. There are lots of things that I don't understand about the world. But what I've seen so far, these set of experiences, have led me to believe that there might be a line here. So people criticize religion a lot by saying, hey, that's faith. That's taking a step too far. I don't think so. I think that that's exactly what science does all the time. We take data that might look like that. We still can't see the trend. The trend doesn't really exist there. It's just what we've observed so far, and we fill it in. That's what faith is. That's what hypothesis making is. That's really a common element to both religion and science. And the final thing I just want to say is that even within the world of science, there may be times when we have to admit the limitations of the domain of science. Times when all of our observations tell us that not only is there a gap that okay, we know what's going on here. There's a different kind of gap. There's a gap that is fundamental, that arises from our knowledge of the world, not from our ignorance of it. There may be times where this exists in nature, where this truly does exist. If I look at the beginning of the universe, I see this. I don't see this side because this doesn't exist, but if you're looking at time, we understand a lot about everything over here. This is the 13.8 billion years. Go back in time, back in time, back in time. We understand a ton up until that first second, that first hundredth of a second of the universe. And before that, we don't really understand a lot at all. So all I want to say is that dots and lines, there's a story about turtles that I won't go into here. But it's just a question of what are your dots, how do you draw your trends? And I think that there are ways of understanding the world through religion, there are ways of understanding the world through science, and really both of them, a lot of the time, will fill in the gaps. The question is whether it's justified, and that's not a scientific enterprise. There are other ways to think about that, but not through hard science. So any questions on believing things we cannot see? I'm sure there are. Yeah.
You had the dots, the line, and the empty spot in the middle.
Yeah. This one?
Well, it seems to me that a lot of people in science would, in between, have a lot of hypotheses.
Yeah.
A lot of it. A religious person might say, no, the dots that I'm going to put in the middle are the gospel.
Yeah.
So there's a difference.
Yeah, definitely. I think that there are definitely more intellectually sound and intellectually unsound ways to fill gaps, for sure. I do think, though, that I see some of the same things in science. For example, I totally trust in the fossil record, but that's just an example of something that looks like this all over the place. We fundamentally think that the fossil record is this, it's a great picture of the world, and it is. It really it corresponds with DNA. Everything that we've ever seen fits directly in the line. But there are plenty of places in the line that aren't filled. There are so many species that we haven't found in between different other ones. And of course, that's something that'll never change. It'll never be the case that we have every species. Every time, the funniest thing about people criticizing the fossil record is that when you find another fossil, they just have one more gap in between fossils to criticize you for. So there's no way to end it. There's no way to end it. But I think it's interesting that these kind of things happen all over the place, and it's really just judgment calls about when it's right and wrong to fill gaps. I agree that there should be more hypothesis testing, though, in a lot of religious
I think
belief.
in science, they'll admit that there's a gap and we don't understand yet, and we're still working through that. Whereas in religions, they go, "Oh, we can explain it by it's a miracle."
Yeah.
Like, God did it.
Yeah.
This is a very, I don't agree with the conclusion. There's a very important difference between science and religion. So you're basically trying to make a case. So there are religious people that have a model somehow, and they do interpolations somehow. And then there's a scientist, they have a model somehow, and sometimes they do interpolations.
Yeah.
Hence, science and religion are somewhat the same. That's manifestly not true, because the scientist makes an interpolation and doesn't know what it's inside, at the center of this diagram. A scientist doesn't pretend he knows. He says, oh, there might be a possible explanation, but we don't know yet. But a religious person would say, yeah, I do know because the Gospels or whatever tell me.
Yeah.
A scientist always seeks evidence and never says, oh yeah, look, I find that theory appealing, it is a nice interpolation, hence I believe it.
Yeah.
That's not happening in science.
Yeah.
String theory, by the way, you mentioned string theory. It's not a scientific theory, it's a mathematical framework. It's a speculative trial and error. And no scientist says, I believe in string theory, that would be a possible explanation for how the universe came into place if you combine this with other theories. Nobody says that.
Yeah.
But you're just trying to say, oh, scientists believe in string theory because it fits neatly, it could explain certain things. No, it's just simply not the case in the science community. That's fundamentally different from religion, where people say, oh yeah, I believe my God did this or that, not being specific. Claims in science about knowledge scale as evidence.
Yeah.
And that is not true for religion, although there is this kind of model, you framed it in a nice way, as a model, like model kind of thinking. In religion, you mentioned Noah's flood, it has to do with observation, and they create a model, a metaphor, but yet there is a difference, because those models in religion don't lead to predictions that can be tested, but in science they do.
Yeah.
That's the asymmetry between those, how do you call it, like Jay Gould said, the word.
The Magisterium.
The Magisterium.
Yeah.
We can make prediction and test it. Also, that is what determines science. Also, theory of evolution. Yeah, we cannot repeat 3.5 billion years of evolution, but we can make predictions and repeat it. For example, we see a fossil record, we see the chronology of fossils here and there, and there's something missing here. Hence, and then scientists, and that happened in the past, that biologists that said, oh, there must be a missing link somewhere here in the strata over there in North America, whatever, and they found it.
Yeah.
That is a feature of science, a prediction, and you can test it. But that does not apply to all the religious models that we see. So that is a difference, and so you try to gloss over it, but I don't agree with your conclusion.
I totally understand that. I think that is the best thing about science, is that they make the predictions first and then observe second. I think that one of the problems is that people make predictions in religion and then just leave it, which is not how that should work at all.
Then they don't develop and they don't evolve.
Yeah,
because scientists are always, scientists are always testing their own models, and they're willing to give it up and to admit error. And that's the reason that science is so fantastically successful. But with religion, it's not the case. We evolved in the last 2,000 years since the emergence of Christianity, not because of Christian scientists doing something, no, because real scientists are doing something, and then change our understanding of the world. And then comes Lewis and says, oh yeah, we have to try to adapt to that, and reframing religion to let it appear as if it was sciencey.
Yeah.
And then I completely disagree.
See, that's one of the things I want to ask about, though, and like this is a broader thing for discussion. I think that there are two simultaneous threads that run like sort of against Christian intellectualism. The one is that Christians are unwilling to change. They're committed to these things and they never change. The other one says that hey, you guys have changed and tried to adapt to science. So like, which one is the best one? I think personally that Christianity should be more adaptive. I have a slide that we don't have to cover because we can just have this conversation. But one of the things that I think that religion needs to change is that it needs to be more susceptible to evolution. It needs to understand that when you get more information, you can understand more things. I think that's one thing that religion absolutely should learn from science. But I think that at the same time, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with religion trying to understand things the way that science does. My whole point, I think that there are two places that I would respectfully disagree. I think that one is that religion does have testable hypotheses. That was one thing that you said earlier, and that's actually something that I brought up at the start of the presentation, is that there are things that should be true if, for example, the world was intelligently designed. Or if, for example, call it that the world was created by somebody who was good, or that it was intentionally created. I think that there are things that you could test about that. And if it's not true that there are things that you could test, then you couldn't prove it wrong, which is a problem.
Certain kind of Christians do make predictions or testable claims. For example, the Earth is 6,000 years old.
Yeah.
And we have
which is testable and wrong. Which is a failed test.
I'm sorry, that is all I'm aware of. Intelligent design doesn't make a real prediction. It says, oh, I don't understand this, hence don't do it. That's all it is. No predictions, nothing. So I'm not aware of any prediction in the real world, any religion that would that has transformed to test and knowledge. I'm not aware of this.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are thinkers who do make the predictions. I mean, Stephen Meyer had a book. It's called The Language in the Cell, and he wrote. And there's a list of 11 predictions that he makes in the back of things that would be true. And so, I mean, they do exist. I think they should exist more than they do.
Maybe the complexity argument also.
Sorry.
You talk about irreducible complexity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, this is long.
I know.
Already.
I don't like that idea either. I talk about that in my book, actually, about how irreducible complexity is not true. There are no irreducible complex features. But one thing that I would say, so I just want to pull this back one step. I think that one of the other things that I talk about a lot and that I'm trying to like kind of understand for myself a lot is the difference between the idealized image of science and how science actually happens for most people in the world, and the idealized image of religion and how religion actually happens for most people in the world. So one of the things that I said in the beginning is that I'm not a scientist, like definitely not. I'm also not a theologian, and most people are not either. So yes, it's true that in good science, in great science, in the way that science should be, there are testable hypotheses all the time, and people are constantly questioning their beliefs, and people are open, and they're like intellectually honest. I think that's definitely the way that science should be. But if you go out to a random person in Times Square in New York City and you ask them about science, they're going to say, this is the truth, this has always been the truth, I believe this right now because it's fact and it's science. Like, that's the way that people think about science in the world. And I think that you can make arguments about, yes, that's a good thing because science has this whole intellectual history behind it and it's like very vibrant, but it's the same thing as 1,000 years ago, everything would be false in your science class. I don't think that everything is false right now that we believe, but I also don't think that everything that we believe to be true right now is going to stay true. And scientists will find that out. Scientists will figure out which of it is true and which is not. But for a person who's going to live for 100 years in this world, they only get that cross-section of the scientific and the religious story. So I think that I personally believe that the same way that science has this idealized image where they've really built it out and they understand, like, here are our hypotheses and here's how we test them and here are the things that make good science. I think that there is a version of religion that is equally good like that. That there is a type of religion that maybe doesn't exist yet, but should, where you take the predictions of things that are typically religious. So there was a creative force behind the universe that was not within the universe. That'd be an example of one of those. And I think there should be ways to test them. And there are folks that are trying now, and I think there should be more folks that are trying.
So
that's how I would.
The Bible or the Quran?
I'll just wrap it up really fast. We can keep talking if you want to, but kind of one of the things that I just wanted to, the real lesson that I wanted to get across is that they're not so different after all. Maybe there are things that are similar between them. Even if it was like all that we've taken out of this is that maybe they both talk about the same things, maybe they have the same magisterium, and maybe they both use the same sort of things. They use models to understand the world. Even if that is all that was got out of this presentation, I think that that's really what I wanted to do. I just wanted to find any sort of middle ground between the two. I think that there are things that can be learned from both. I think that religion in particular could learn a lesson about falsifiability, making hypotheses and testing them. I think that's something that they could and should do. Some folks are doing it, but to be fair, it's not a lot. I think that they should be more comfortable with their ideas evolving as they get more facts, as they understand more things about the universe. It seems unbelievable to me that you would have 2,000 years to explore a universe that was given to you by a divine creator, and to have kept your beliefs exactly the same seems like almost disrespectful, if you ask me, if that's how you were looking at it. And then also intellectualism, you can hardly read that, but that's what it says. I don't think that there's necessarily anything anti-intellectual about religion, or that there has to be. In fact, that's kind of what I've been trying to do, is bring in a little bit of intellectualism to religion. I also think that there are things that atheism, and particularly science, could learn from religion. The first one and the first and the second are effectively the same thing, but it's just building community. That's why I think the groups like this are so important, and that's why I think that trying to get the word out there about things that you believe and really bringing these things into the open are better, because people leave these kind of conversations understanding, even if they don't agree, even if you totally disagree with everything I've said, you still understand what I think now. So, and that's helpful. That is something that is a piece of data that you now all have and that you can use in the rest of your lives. And maybe it doesn't affect you a ton. Maybe it doesn't affect the way that you think about science, but maybe, just maybe, you'll go look at that Pew Research study. Or maybe you'll go dig into all the different evidence that, like I brought up, between models. Maybe you'll read this book, maybe you'll read my book, whatever it happens to be. This is a piece of evidence that comes about from getting together in a community and having a discussion. And that's something that I think that, in particular, religion does really well. They have meetings every week where there are thousands and thousands and millions of people that come and all talk about the things and rah-rah around the things that we believe. And I think that there's no equivalent really for science. And then finally, this is probably the one piece that we talked the most about here, but faith in science. I do sincerely believe that a lot of the ways that people, like not necessarily scientists, not even people who are doing it right, but lots of people take science on faith. I truly believe that is true, that most people don't look into it. Most people don't understand evolution. Most people don't understand the beginning of the universe and the Big Bang. Most people don't understand how human consciousness came to be, but they still believe in it. So I think that that's an important point that's the point I want to leave you all with, is that there is faith in science. There really is. It's not the best way to do it, but I honestly don't think that just accepting religion as true is the best way to do that either. So there are better and worse ways to do science and religion. I think that there's a productive magisterium in the middle that could be that you could dive into and understand the world a little bit better by having both instead of just one.